The morning sun beat down on the military training ground as Sarah Mitchell stood in formation with 40 other recruits. Sweat dripped down her face, mixing with the dust that covered her uniform. She had been at the base for 3 weeks now, and every single day felt like a test of her limits. The other recruits around her looked just as exhausted, their faces red from the intense physical drills they had been doing since 5 in the morning. Sergeant Marcus Kane walked slowly in front of the formation, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. Everyone at the base knew about Sergeant Kane. He had a reputation for being the toughest drill instructor, the one who broke even the strongest recruits. Some said he enjoyed it too much, that he took pleasure in seeing people fail. Sarah had heard the whispers in the barracks late at night, stories about how he would single out recruits and push them beyond their breaking point. Sarah kept her eyes forward, trying not to draw attention to herself. She had learned quickly that standing out was never a good thing during training. The less Sergeant Kane noticed you, the better your day would go. But today something felt different. She could feel his eyes on her as he paced back and forth. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. The sergeant stopped directly in front of her. Sarah could smell the coffee on his breath as he leaned in close, inspecting her uniform. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond him. "Mitchell," he barked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. "Your boots are a disgrace. Did you even bother to polish them this morning, or were you too busy painting your nails?" A few snickers rippled through the formation. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She had spent an hour polishing those boots before dawn, making sure every inch gleamed. They were spotless. Everyone could see that. This wasn't about her boots at all. "Yes, Sergeant. I polished them this morning, Sergeant," she replied, keeping her voice steady and respectful. Sergeant Kane's eyes narrowed. He didn't like her answer. Sarah could see the challenge in his expression, the way his jaw tightened. He took a step closer, invading her personal space in a way that made her skin crawl. "Are you questioning my assessment, recruit?" His voice was dangerously quiet now. "No, Sergeant," Sarah answered quickly. "Good, because I think you need a reminder of what standards look like in my unit." "Everyone take a knee," he shouted to the formation. "Mitchell here is going to demonstrate proper push-up form for us. 50 of them, and if I see even one sloppy rep, we start over from 0. Sarah dropped to the ground and assumed the push-up position. Her arms were already trembling from the morning's exercises, but she pushed through the burn. 1, 2, 3. She counted in her head, focusing on her form, making sure each push-up was perfect. The gravel dug into her palms and the sun seemed to grow hotter with each repetition. At 25, her arms began to shake violently. She could hear Sergeant Kane walking around her, his boots appearing in her peripheral vision with each step. She pushed through 30, then 35. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "Pathetic form, Mitchell. Start over," Kane said coldly. Sarah felt a surge of anger but swallowed it down. She knew what he was doing. This wasn't training. This was harassment. She had seen him do this to other female recruits, always finding some excuse to single them out, to humiliate them in front of everyone. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She started again. 1, 2, 3. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she kept going. The other recruits watched in uncomfortable silence. Some looked sympathetic, others looked relieved it wasn't them down in the dirt. At 40 push-ups, Sarah's arms gave out. She collapsed onto her stomach, gasping for air. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion. She had nothing left to give. "Get up, Mitchell. We're not done here," Sergeant Kane said, standing directly over her. "In combat, the enemy doesn't care if you're tired. They don't care if you're weak. If you can't handle this, you don't belong here." Sarah pushed herself up onto her knees, her arms shaking so badly she could barely support her own weight. She looked up at the sergeant, and for just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just about training standards or pushing recruits to be better. There was something personal in his gaze, something that went beyond professional discipline. "On your feet, recruit," he commanded. Sarah stood, swaying slightly. Her vision swam and she had to concentrate just to stay upright. The sergeant circled her like a predator sizing up prey. "I don't think you're cut out for this, Mitchell. Maybe you should consider a different career path, something more suited to your abilities. Have you thought about being a secretary?" His words dripped with contempt. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Even they could sense that something was wrong with this situation. This wasn't normal drill instructor behavior. This was targeted. This was personal. Sarah took a deep breath and met his eyes. "I'm not quitting, Sergeant." Something flickered across Kane's face. Surprise, maybe, or anger. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him, even in such a small way. Most recruits would have looked down, would have accepted the humiliation and moved on, but Sarah held his gaze. "We'll see about that," he said quietly so only she could hear, then louder to the formation. "Everyone back in formation. We've wasted enough time on Mitchell's inadequacies." As Sarah took her place back in line, her legs wobbling beneath her, she realized something important. This was only the beginning. Sergeant Kane had decided she was his target, and he wouldn't stop until either she quit or he found another victim to torment. But Sarah Mitchell had grown up with 3 older brothers who had tried to intimidate her whole life. She had learned long ago that bullies only had power if you gave it to them. She didn't know it yet, but the real test was still to come. In just a few days, Sergeant Kane would push her too far, and when he did, everything would change. Not just for her, but for every recruit who had ever suffered under his abuse. The sergeant thought he was breaking her down, but he was actually forging something much stronger than he could imagine. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the formation continued their training. Sarah's arms ached. Her pride was wounded, but her determination had never been stronger. Whatever came next, she would be ready. 3 days passed, and Sergeant Kane's attention on Sarah only intensified. Every morning inspection, he found something wrong with her appearance. Her bed wasn't made properly. Her locker was disorganized. Her responses weren't quick enough. The other recruits had started to notice the pattern, and some began keeping their distance from her, afraid that associating with Kane's target might make them targets too. But Sarah wasn't completely alone. There was Marcus Chen, a recruit from California who had become her friend during the first week of training. He was a quiet guy with a sharp mind and a quick sense of humor that helped lighten the mood during their rare moments of downtime. And there was Jessica Rodriguez, a former college athlete who had the kind of physical strength that made even the male recruits respect her. Both of them had started to speak up when Kane's treatment of Sarah became too obvious. On Thursday morning, the recruits were scheduled for hand-to-hand combat training. This was always the most intense part of their week, where they learned basic self-defense techniques and practiced them on each other under the watchful eyes of the drill instructors. Sarah had actually been looking forward to it. She had taken self-defense classes back home and felt confident in her abilities. The training yard was set up with thick mats spread across the ground. Sergeant Kane stood at the center, demonstrating various holds and takedown techniques on another instructor who had volunteered to help. The recruits watched carefully, knowing they would be expected to replicate these moves perfectly. "Combat isn't about being the biggest or the strongest," Kane explained, his voice carrying across the yard. "It's about leverage, timing, and the will to fight. In a real combat situation, you need to be able to defend yourself against opponents who might be bigger and stronger than you." He demonstrated a wrist lock that transitioned into a takedown, moving smoothly through the technique. The recruits nodded along, some taking mental notes. "Now I need a volunteer to help demonstrate the next technique," Kane said, his eyes scanning the formation. Sarah's stomach dropped before he even said her name. She knew what was coming. Mitchell, front and center. Sarah stepped forward onto the mat, keeping her face neutral despite the anxiety crawling up her spine. She had a bad feeling about this, but refusing would only make things worse. The other recruits formed a circle around the mat, watching intently. "This next technique is a ground defense. If an opponent takes you down and pins you, you need to know how to escape," Kane explained. He moved behind Sarah. "Get down on your back, Mitchell." Sarah lowered herself to the mat, lying flat on her back. Her muscles were tense, ready. Kane dropped down beside her, and before she could prepare herself, he was on top of her, using his full body weight to pin her down. His hands gripped her wrists and pressed them into the mat above her head. His knee pressed into her stomach, and his face was inches from hers. "The key is to stay calm and find the opening," he said to the watching recruits, but his eyes were locked on Sarah's face. The position felt wrong, too intimate, too aggressive for a training demonstration. Sarah could feel her heart racing, not from exertion, but from a primal sense of danger. Kane's grip tightened on her wrists. The untrained response is to panic, to struggle wildly. But that just wastes energy. He pressed down harder and Sarah felt the air squeeze from her lungs. This wasn't a normal training hold. He was using too much force, his weight crushing down on her in a way that went beyond demonstration. "Sergeant," Sarah gasped, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can't breathe properly. That's the point, Mitchell. In combat, the enemy won't care about your comfort." His voice was cold, and there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's blood run cold. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Even they could sense that something was wrong. Sarah tried to use the technique he had just demonstrated, attempting to shift her hips and create space. But Kane anticipated every move, his experience allowing him to counter her attempts effortlessly. He was showing off now, demonstrating his dominance not just physically but psychologically. "You see, class, this is what happens when you don't take your training seriously," Kane said, pressing down even harder. Sarah's vision started to blur at the edges. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Panic began to set in, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she realized Kane wasn't planning to let her go until he had proven whatever twisted point he was trying to make. "Sergeant Kane," a voice called out. It was Marcus Chen. "I think we understand the technique now." Kane's head snapped toward Marcus, his expression dangerous. "Did I ask for your input, Chen?" "No, Sergeant, but Mitchell looks like she's actually struggling to breathe." For a moment, Kane's grip loosened slightly, and Sarah sucked in a desperate breath. But instead of letting her up, he shifted his weight, changing the position. Now his forearm pressed against her throat, not quite choking her, but applying enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "This is a carotid restraint," Kane announced to the group. "Used properly, it can render an opponent unconscious in seconds. Used improperly, it can cause serious injury." The implied threat hung in the air. Sarah's mind raced. She could feel the pressure building in her head, could feel her strength beginning to fade. But somewhere deep inside, a switch flipped. All the humiliation, all the harassment, all the targeted abuse of the past few weeks crystallized into a single moment of clarity. She wasn't going to be another one of his victims. She wasn't going to let this man break her. Her self-defense instructor's voice echoed in her memory. "When someone has you pinned and you're running out of options, you create an opening by doing something they don't expect." Sarah stopped struggling. She let her body go completely limp, as if she had passed out. Kane's grip loosened immediately, concern flickering across his face despite himself. He didn't want a recruit actually passing out during a demonstration. That would bring questions, investigations, problems he didn't want. In that split second when his attention wavered and his grip relaxed, Sarah struck. She brought her knee up hard and fast, using the element of surprise. At the same time, she twisted her wrists in the one direction he wasn't controlling, breaking free of his hold. The movements flowed together like water, muscle memory from years of training taking over. Kane tried to recover, to reassert his position, but Sarah was already moving. She had created the space she needed, and now she used it. Rolling to the side, she reversed their positions in one fluid motion, using Kane's own momentum against him. Suddenly, Sergeant Marcus Kane found himself on his back on the training mat, with Sarah Mitchell straddling his chest, her knee pressing into his solar plexus, one hand controlling his right arm. The entire reversal had taken less than 3 seconds. The training yard fell completely silent. 40 recruits stood frozen, their mouths open in shock. Even the other instructors who had been supervising nearby stopped what they were doing and stared. Sarah could feel Sergeant Kane's chest heaving beneath her. His face had turned bright red and his eyes blazed with a mixture of shock and fury. For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's own heart pounded in her chest as the reality of what she had just done sank in. She had just pinned her drill instructor to the ground in front of the entire unit. Kane's voice came out as a strangled growl. "Get off me, Mitchell." Sarah immediately released him and stood up, stepping back to attention. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she kept her face calm. Kane rolled to his feet with surprising speed for a man his size, brushing dust off his uniform. The muscle in his jaw twitched as he stared at her, and Sarah could practically see him calculating his next move. The other recruits watched the standoff with wide eyes. Some looked terrified, others looked excited, and a few looked like they wanted to cheer but knew better than to make a sound. Jessica Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye from across the circle and gave the smallest nod of approval. "Well," Kane said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "it seems Mitchell has been holding back on us." That was quite the display of technique. He turned to address the group, though his eyes kept flicking back to Sarah. This is exactly what I was trying to demonstrate. Never underestimate your opponent. Use the element of surprise. Mitchell here clearly has some prior training that she failed to mention during intake. Sarah remained at attention, knowing that anything she said right now could only make things worse. Let him spin it however he wanted. At least she had shown that she wasn't helpless, that she could fight back when pushed too far. However, Kane continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone, what Mitchell also demonstrated is a lack of discipline. In a real training scenario, you don't reverse your instructor. You tap out. You signal that you've had enough. You follow protocol. He stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that she could see the vein throbbing in his temple. That kind of aggression toward a superior officer could be considered assault. A cold wave of fear washed over Sarah. He was going to try to make her the bad guy in this situation. He was going to twist what had happened into some kind of disciplinary issue. She had just given him exactly the ammunition he needed to not just harass her, but to potentially end her military career before it even started. With all due respect, Sergeant, a voice spoke up. It was Jessica Rodriguez stepping forward from the circle. Mitchell was demonstrating the exact technique you told her to use. You said to escape from a ground pin. That's what she did. Kane's head swiveled toward Jessica like a gun turret finding a new target. Did I ask for your commentary, Rodriguez? No, Sergeant. But I thought accuracy was important in training reports. Jessica's voice was steady, respectful, but firm. She was putting herself on the line, and everyone knew it. Before Kane could respond, another voice joined in. Marcus Chen. Sergeant, from where I was standing, it looked like Mitchell executed a perfect defensive reversal. That's good training, isn't it? Isn't that what we're here to learn? Now Kane had a problem. If one recruit spoke up, he could silence them. But with multiple witnesses supporting Sarah's version of events, things got complicated. Other recruits began to murmur in agreement, their voices creating a low buzz around the training yard. Sergeant Kane's face went from red to purple. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Sarah thought he might actually try to strike someone, but then another instructor, Sergeant Williams, walked over quickly. Everything okay here, Kane? Williams asked. He was an older man, well respected on the base with a reputation for being tough but fair. His eyes took in the scene, the disrupted training mat, Kane's furious expression, Sarah standing at rigid attention, and the circle of tense recruits. Just fine, Williams. Just demonstrating ground defense techniques, Kane said through gritted teeth. Williams looked at Sarah, then back at Kane. I heard some interesting sounds from over here. Sounded like quite the demonstration. Mitchell has some prior self-defense training that came out during the exercise, Kane said, forcing his voice to sound casual. Got a bit overzealous with the reversal technique. Williams nodded slowly. Well, enthusiasm is good. Show spirit. He looked directly at Sarah. Mitchell, you hurt? No, Sergeant Williams, Sarah replied clearly. And you, Kane? Everything all right? The question hung in the air. Kane couldn't admit that a recruit half his size had gotten the better of him without looking weak. But he also couldn't lie to a fellow instructor. I'm fine. Just surprised. Mitchell's technique was better than expected. Good to hear, Williams said with a slight smile. Maybe she should help demonstrate the next technique. Show the others how it's done properly. It was said pleasantly enough, but there was steel underneath the words. Williams was making it clear that whatever had been happening here, it was over now. Kane's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he nodded curtly. Maybe next session. I think we've had enough demonstrations for today. He turned to the recruits. Everyone pair up. Practice the wrist lock technique I showed you earlier. 30 minutes, then we're doing 3 miles. The recruits quickly paired off, grateful to have something to do that would take them away from the tension. Sarah found herself paired with Marcus Chen, who gave her a subtle thumbs up as they moved to an empty section of mat. That was incredible, Marcus whispered, as they began practicing. I've never seen anyone do that to Kane before. I think I just made everything worse, Sarah whispered back, executing the wrist lock slowly so Marcus could feel how it worked. Are you kidding? You made everything better. Every person out here has been waiting for someone to stand up to that bully. Marcus reversed their positions and tried the technique himself. He's been getting away with this stuff for too long. Sarah glanced over at where Sergeant Kane stood, watching the training with his arms crossed. His eyes found hers across the yard, and the look he gave her made her stomach clench. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She had embarrassed him in front of everyone, and men like Kane didn't forget something like that. Sergeant Williams approached Sarah during a water break. Mitchell, a word. Sarah followed him a short distance away from the other recruits. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was she in trouble? Was Williams going to back up Kane's version of events? I don't know what's been going on between you and Sergeant Kane, Williams said quietly. But I've been around long enough to recognize when something isn't right. If you're having problems with your training instructor, there are proper channels to report it. Sarah wanted to tell him everything. About the constant harassment, the targeted humiliation, the way Kane seemed to take personal pleasure in trying to break her down. But she also knew how the military worked. Reporting a superior officer rarely ended well for the person making the report, especially a brand new recruit with no power or connections. Thank you, Sergeant Williams, but I can handle my training, Sarah said carefully. Williams studied her face for a long moment. I'm sure you can. But remember, you're not alone out here. We have procedures for a reason. He handed her a small card with a phone number on it. That's the base advocate's office. If you ever need it. Sarah took the card, tucking it into her pocket. Thank you, Sergeant. As Williams walked away, Sarah rejoined her unit. The rest of the training session passed without incident, but the atmosphere had changed. The other recruits looked at Sarah differently now. Some with respect, some with concern, and a few with the kind of admiration usually reserved for someone who had done something impossibly brave or impossibly stupid. That night in the barracks, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of 40 other recruits breathing and snoring around her. Her body ached from the day's training, but her mind wouldn't shut off. She kept replaying the moment on the mat, the look on Kane's face when she had pinned him down, the shocked silence from everyone watching. She had crossed a line today, even if it had been justified. In the rigid hierarchy of military training, what she had done was borderline insubordination. Kane could make her life miserable now, and there would be very little she could do about it. He had the power, the rank, and the system behind him. A soft whisper came from the bunk next to hers. You awake, Sarah? It was Jessica Rodriguez. Yeah, Sarah whispered back. Can't sleep either. No. There was a pause, then Jessica spoke again. What you did today took guts, but you need to be careful. Kane's not going to let this go. I know, Sarah admitted quietly. I didn't plan it. He was pressing too hard, I couldn't breathe right, and I just reacted. I believe you. And so does everyone else who was there. That's why people spoke up. Kane pushed too far and we all saw it. Jessica shifted in her bunk. But that doesn't mean he won't try to get revenge somehow. Guys like him always do. Sarah knew Jessica was right. The question was, what form would that revenge take? Would Kane try to wash her out of training through legitimate means, finding real reasons to fail her? Or would he do something more direct, more personal? She didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning started normally enough. Wake-up call at 5, quick shower, breakfast in the mess hall, and then morning formation. But when Sergeant Kane called out the day's assignments, Sarah noticed something odd. While most of the unit was assigned to weapons training and tactical exercises, Sarah and 2 other recruits were assigned to KP duty. Kitchen patrol, the most tedious and undesirable job on the base. Mitchell, Davis, and Thompson report to the mess hall. You'll be on dishes and floor detail until 1800 hours, Kane announced with a slight smile. Sarah felt the injustice of it, but kept her face neutral. She had scrubbed floors and washed dishes before. It was meant to be punishment duty, but it was just work. She could handle work. What she didn't know was that Kane had something else planned. The mess hall was a huge industrial kitchen that served over 1,000 people daily. Mountains of dishes, pots, and pans piled up after every meal. Sarah, along with Davis and Thompson, spent hours up to their elbows in hot, soapy water. The work was monotonous and exhausting, made worse by the humid heat of the kitchen and the constant stream of dirty dishes. Around noon, one of the mess sergeants, a heavyset woman named Sergeant Collins, approached Sarah. Mitchell, we need someone to clean out the grease trap in the back. You're up. Sarah had heard about the grease trap. It was the worst job in the entire mess hall, a disgusting, back-breaking task that involved scooping out weeks' worth of congealed cooking grease and food waste. The smell alone was enough to make grown men vomit. It was the kind of job usually reserved for serious disciplinary cases. "Yes, Sergeant," Sarah said, setting down the dish she was washing. She made her way to the back of the kitchen where the grease trap was located. The smell hit her before she even opened it, a thick, nauseating odor that made her eyes water. She pulled on rubber gloves and a face mask and got to work, trying not to think too hard about what she was scooping into the waste barrel. She had been working for about 20 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Sergeant Kane standing there, his arms crossed, that same slight smile on his face. "How's the work going, Mitchell?" he asked. "Fine, Sergeant," Sarah replied, turning back to her task. "You know, this is where people who don't follow the rules end up," Kane said conversationally. "Down in the filth, doing the jobs nobody else wants to do. Makes you think about your choices, doesn't it?" Sarah kept working, refusing to take the bait. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset or angry. Kane stepped closer. "I've been thinking about yesterday's training incident. The more I think about it, the more I realize it was a serious breach of protocol. A recruit attacking her instructor could face court-martial in some circumstances." Sarah's hands stilled on the scoop. Her heart began to pound. Was he seriously threatening her with court-martial over a training exercise? "I wasn't attacking you, Sergeant. I was executing the escape technique you instructed me to perform," Sarah said carefully, keeping her voice level. "That's your interpretation," Kane said. "But intent can be difficult to prove, can it? And with your prior self-defense training that you failed to disclose during intake, it could look like you came here with an agenda. Maybe you have an attitude problem with male authority figures." Sarah felt cold despite the humid heat of the kitchen. He was building a narrative, creating a paper trail that would justify whatever he wanted to do to her. This was more calculated than she had realized. "I have no problem with authority, Sergeant. I'm here to serve," Sarah said. "We'll see," Kane replied, "because I've decided to recommend that you undergo a psychological evaluation. Your behavior yesterday showed signs of aggression and poor impulse control. We need to make sure you're fit for military service." Sarah's mind raced. A psych eval could be used to wash her out of training completely. If Kane had friends in the medical department, they could find reasons to deem her unfit. They could end her career before it even started, and there would be nothing she could do about it. "That's your right, Sergeant," Sarah said quietly, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'll cooperate fully with any evaluation." Kane seemed disappointed by her calm response. He had wanted to see her break, to see fear or anger or panic. Instead, Sarah just stood there, covered in grease and filth, looking him straight in the eye. "Finish up here and report back to the barracks at 1800 hours, Kane said curtly, then turned and walked away. As soon as he was gone, Sarah slumped against the wall, her hands shaking. This was worse than she thought. Kane wasn't just harassing her anymore. He was actively trying to end her military career, and he had the rank and the system to do it. But Sarah Mitchell was not someone who gave up easily. As she finished cleaning the grease trap and washed the filth from her hands and uniform, her mind was already working on a plan. If Kane wanted to build a paper trail against her, then she would build one of her own. She would document every incident, every inappropriate comment, every excessive punishment. She would find allies among the other recruits and instructors who had seen what was happening, and she would be ready when Kane made his next move, because she knew with certainty that he would. Men like him always pushed further, always escalated. They couldn't help themselves. Kane had made it personal, and that was his mistake. Because when things were personal, people fought back twice as hard. That evening, Sarah sat down with Jessica and Marcus in a quiet corner of the barracks. She pulled out the card Sergeant Williams had given her, the number for the base advocate's office. "I need to tell you both something," she said quietly, "and I need your help." They listened as Sarah explained everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Every incident, every humiliation, every time Kane had singled her out, and she told them about his threat of a psych evaluation. "He's trying to force you out," Marcus said, his expression grim. "That's his pattern. I heard about him doing this to a female recruit 2 cycles ago. She ended up quitting before the psych eval could happen." "I'm not quitting," Sarah said firmly, "but I need witnesses. I need people who will back up my version of events if this goes to an investigation." "You have us," Jessica said immediately. "And I bet there are others who will speak up too. A lot of people saw what happened yesterday." "It's risky," Sarah warned. "Speaking against a drill instructor can destroy your career too." Some things are more important than career, Marcus replied. What Kane is doing is wrong. It's been wrong for a long time and someone needs to stop him. The next few days were a strange kind of waiting game. Sarah went through her training with meticulous precision, making sure that every task was completed perfectly, every order followed to the letter. She gave Sergeant Kane no legitimate reason to punish or criticize her. At the same time, she quietly gathered her evidence. Marcus had a small notebook that he used to keep track of training schedules. Sarah borrowed it and began documenting dates, times, and detailed descriptions of every incident with Kane. Jessica talked to other recruits, finding out who else had witnessed the harassment or experienced it themselves. It turned out that Sarah wasn't the first female recruit Kane had targeted, just the first one to fight back so publicly. A recruit named Amanda Chen from a previous training cycle had transferred to a different unit after Kane's treatment became unbearable. She had never filed an official complaint, but she agreed to write down what had happened to her if it would help stop Kane from hurting others. 2 other current recruits, both women, came forward with their own stories of inappropriate comments and excessive punishments. Sergeant Williams had noticed the shift in atmosphere among the recruits. He pulled Sarah aside during weapons training on Tuesday. "Mitchell, I'm going to ask you something directly and I want an honest answer," he said. "Are you planning to file a complaint against Sergeant Kane?" Sarah hesitated. Williams seemed like a decent man, but he was still part of the system. She didn't know if she could trust him completely. "I'm considering my options, Sergeant," she said carefully. Williams nodded slowly. "That's a diplomatic answer. Let me give you some advice off the record. If you're going to file a complaint, make sure your evidence is solid. Document everything. Get witnesses, because men like Kane have been in the system a long time and they have friends. You'll need an airtight case." "That sounds like you believe me," Sarah said, surprised. "I've been watching Kane for years," Williams admitted. "I've had my suspicions about his training methods, but suspicions aren't enough. Nobody has ever been willing to formally complain before. They either wash out or transfer. If you're brave enough to stand up and speak the truth, I'll back you up with what I've observed, but you need to be prepared for a fight." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Having an experienced instructor like Williams in her corner made a huge difference. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot. Just remember, the military system can be slow and complicated. This won't be resolved quickly," Williams warned. "In the meantime, keep your head down and your performance up. Don't give Kane any ammunition to use against you." But Kane wasn't planning to wait for a slow system. He was planning something more immediate. On Friday morning, the unit was scheduled for their first overnight field exercise. They would march 10 miles to a remote training area, set up camp, practice tactical maneuvers, and spend the night in the field before marching back the next morning. It was a significant test of endurance and teamwork, and everyone was nervous about it. Sergeant Kane led the formation as they marched out of the base. The weather was hot and humid, and the packs on their backs weighed at least 50 pounds. Sarah kept pace with the others, focusing on her breathing and her steps, trying not to think about the long miles ahead. About 3 miles in, Kane called for a short break. The recruits gratefully dropped their packs and drank water. Sarah sat on a rock, massaging her sore shoulders. Jessica sat down next to her. "You doing okay?" Jessica asked. "Yeah, just tired. These packs are brutal," Sarah replied. "Tell me about it." "I think mine weighs more than I do." Jessica lowered her voice. "Listen, I've got a bad feeling about this field exercise. Kane has been too quiet the past few days. He's planning something." Sarah had the same feeling, but she tried to push it down. "What can he do out here? There are 40 of us and 3 instructors. I don't know, but just stay alert, okay? Don't let yourself get separated from the group." They marched for another hour before reaching the training area. It was a clearing in a wooded area, far from any roads or buildings. The recruits set up their tents and began preparing for the night's exercises. Kane divided them into 4 squads for a navigation exercise. Each squad would be given coordinates and had to find their way to a checkpoint and back using only a map and compass. When Kane announced the squad assignments, Sarah's bad feeling intensified. She had been placed in a squad with 3 male recruits she barely knew, and their checkpoint was the farthest from base camp. Jessica and Marcus were both in different squads with closer checkpoints. "Mitchell's squad, you have 2 hours to reach your checkpoint and return," Kane announced. "Don't be late or your entire squad fails the exercise. Move out." Sarah's squad gathered their gear and studied the map. The checkpoint was about 3 miles away through dense forest. They would need to move quickly to make it back in time. "Let's go," said Jackson, the biggest guy in their squad. "Mitchell, you navigate. You're supposed to be good at this stuff." Sarah took the compass and map and led the way into the forest. The terrain was rough with thick underbrush and steep slopes. They made good time at first, but about halfway to the checkpoint they encountered a problem. A ravine that wasn't marked on their map blocked their path. "We need to go around," Sarah said, studying the map. "If we head east for about half a mile, we should be able to cross safely." "That's going to take too long," Jackson protested. "We can climb down here and save time." Sarah looked at the ravine. It was steep and rocky, easily 40 feet deep. Climbing down would be dangerous, especially with full packs. "I don't think that's smart. We could get hurt." "Are you scared, Mitchell?" Jackson challenged. "I thought you were supposed to be tough." Sarah bit back her frustration. This was exactly the kind of stupid masculinity that got people injured in training. But she was outvoted. The other 2 guys in the squad sided with Jackson. They began climbing down the ravine carefully. Sarah went last, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting her weight to it. About halfway down, she heard a shout from above. "Mitchell! Heads up!" She looked up just in time to see a loose rock dislodged by one of the other climbers tumbling toward her. She flattened herself against the ravine wall, but the rock clipped her shoulder hard enough to make her lose her grip. For a terrifying moment, she felt herself falling. Her hand shot out and caught a root jutting from the ravine wall. She dangled there, her shoulder screaming in pain, her pack threatening to pull her backward. Below her was a 30-foot drop onto rocks. "Mitchell, hang on!" Jackson shouted from below. Sarah's fingers were slipping on the root. Her injured shoulder couldn't support her weight properly. She looked around desperately for another handhold, but the rock face was smooth here. Panic started to set in. Then she heard a voice from above. A voice that made her blood run cold. "Having trouble, Mitchell?" It was Sergeant Kane. He had followed her squad into the forest. Sarah looked up to see him standing at the top of the ravine, looking down at her with that same slight smile. He made no move to help her. He just stood there watching. "Sergeant," Jackson called out. "We need a rope." "Do you, recruit?" "Because it seems to me that Mitchell chose to climb down here against standard safety protocols." "Looks like a failure of judgment to me," Kane said calmly. Sarah's grip on the root was failing. Her fingers screamed with the strain, and her injured shoulder sent jolts of agony through her entire body with each passing second. Below her, Jackson and the other 2 recruits were frantically looking for a way to climb up to help her, but the ravine wall was too steep. "Sergeant Kane, please," Sarah gasped, looking up at him. "I need help." Kane crouched down at the edge of the ravine, still making no move to assist. "You know, Mitchell, this is what happens when people don't know their limitations. When they think they're tougher than they really are. When they show off and embarrass their instructors." His voice was cold, calculated. "Maybe if you had been more respectful, more humble, you wouldn't be in this situation." In that moment, Sarah understood with perfect clarity that Kane had planned this. He had put her in a squad with recruits he knew would make bad decisions. He had followed them, waiting for an opportunity like this. He wanted her to fail, to get hurt, maybe even worse. This wasn't training. This was revenge. But Sarah Mitchell had not come this far to let a bitter, cruel man destroy her. Her mother had raised her to be strong. Her brothers had taught her to never give up. And her own experience had taught her that when someone tries to break you, you have 2 choices: break or become unbreakable. She closed her eyes for just a second, pushing past the pain and fear. Then she opened them and looked around with absolute focus. 3 feet to her left, there was a small ledge she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. She would have to swing her body to reach it using momentum she didn't think she had left. "Mitchell, what are you doing?" Jackson called from below, hearing her moving. Sarah didn't answer. She took one deep breath, then began to swing her body, using her legs to build momentum. Pain exploded through her shoulder with each swing, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. On the 3rd swing, she released the root and threw herself toward the ledge. For a heart-stopping moment, she was airborne, nothing but air beneath her. Then her hands hit the ledge and caught hold. She pulled herself up with every ounce of strength she had left, ignoring the agony in her shoulder, ignoring Kane's presence above her, ignoring everything except survival. She made it onto the ledge, then pressed herself against the rock face, breathing hard. From there she could see a safer path down. She carefully made her way to the bottom of the ravine where her squad mates rushed to help her. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked, his face pale with shock. That was insane. Sarah looked up at the top of the ravine. Kane still stood there, but his expression had changed. The smile was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Frustration, maybe, or anger. He had expected her to either beg for his help or fall. Mitchell's squad, you have 45 minutes to reach your checkpoint and return. Kane called down. Better hurry or you'll fail. Then he turned and walked away. Sarah wanted to scream at him, to curse him, to tell him exactly what kind of person he was. But instead she checked her shoulder, tested her range of motion, and picked up her pack. Come on, she said to her squad. We have a checkpoint to reach. They made it back to camp with 3 minutes to spare. Sarah's shoulder throbbed with every movement, and she was pretty sure she had pulled something, but she had completed the mission. More importantly, she had 3 witnesses to what Kane had done, or more accurately, what he had failed to do. That night, while the rest of the camp slept, Sarah sat by the dying fire and made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. Kane had just proved that he was willing to put her in actual danger. Next time, she might not be able to save herself. In the morning, after the unit marched back to base, Sarah went directly to Sergeant Williams. I need to file a formal complaint, she said without preamble, against Sergeant Kane, and I have multiple witnesses ready to give statements. Williams looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Come with me. We're going to the commanding officer's office right now. The next few weeks were the hardest of Sarah's life. The investigation into Sergeant Kane's conduct was thorough and intense. Sarah had to give multiple statements, detailing every incident of harassment and abuse. Jessica, Marcus, and the other recruits who had witnessed Kane's behavior gave their own testimony. Amanda Chen came back to the base to share her story. Even some of the kitchen staff corroborated the unusual punishment details Kane had assigned to Sarah. Sergeant Williams testified about his own observations over the years. He described a pattern of behavior toward female recruits that went beyond tough training and crossed into harassment and discrimination. Other instructors, once they learned an official investigation was underway, came forward with their own concerns about Kane's methods. Kane, for his part, denied everything. He claimed Sarah was a problem recruit with attitude issues. He said the training mat incident was her showing dangerous aggression. He insisted that every punishment he had given her was by the book and deserved. His defense was that he was just a tough instructor dealing with a recruit who couldn't handle military standards, but the evidence was overwhelming. Too many witnesses, too many incidents, too detailed a pattern. The ravine incident was particularly damaging to his case. Jackson and the other squad members testified that Kane had watched Sarah struggle and offered no assistance, making statements about her showing off and embarrassing him. 8 weeks after Sarah filed her complaint, Sergeant Marcus Kane was removed from his position as a drill instructor. He was reassigned to administrative duties pending further disciplinary action. Eventually, he chose to retire rather than face a formal court-martial. His career was over. Sarah completed her basic training under a new instructor, Sergeant Williams, who proved that it was possible to be demanding and tough without being cruel or abusive. She finished at the top of her class and went on to have an exemplary military career. But more than that, Sarah's courage in speaking up changed things at the base. New protocols were put in place for reporting instructor misconduct. Witnesses were given stronger protections. Female recruits were no longer isolated in squads where harassment could happen unseen. The base implemented mandatory training on appropriate instructor-recruit relationships for all drill instructors. Years later, Sarah was a captain, running her own training program. She made it a point to talk to every new female recruit, to let them know that they had a voice, that they had rights, and that no one had the authority to abuse them, no matter how many stripes they wore. She never forgot the feeling of hanging from that root in the ravine, looking up at Kane's smile as he watched her struggle. But she also never forgot the feeling of pulling herself up onto that ledge through sheer determination. That moment had defined her more than any other in her career. It was the moment she learned that she was stronger than anyone who tried to break her. The sergeant had pinned her to the ground thinking he had won. But she had broken free, and in doing so, she had broken the cycle of abuse that had hurt so many before her. She had left him humiliated, yes, but more importantly, she had left him powerless to hurt anyone else. And that, Sarah thought, was the real victory. Some people might say that filing the complaint was the brave part. But Sarah knew better. The brave part was that first moment on the training mat when she decided not to be a victim. The brave part was every day after that when she chose to stand up rather than back down. The brave part was believing that the truth mattered more than the convenience of staying silent. Sergeant Marcus. Kane thought he could use his rank and his position to destroy a young recruit who dared to challenge him. Instead, he had awakened a strength in her that would go on to protect and inspire countless others. He had tried to break her, but in the end, he was the one who was broken, not by her physically pinning him that day on the mat, but by the consequences of his own cruelty finally catching up with him. Sometimes justice is slow. Sometimes it requires incredible courage from people with very little power, but when it finally comes, it changes everything. Sarah Mitchell understood that now, and she made sure that every recruit who passed through her training understood it too. Stand up, speak up. Fight back when fighting is necessary, and never ever let someone tell you that abuse is just part of the process, because it isn't, and it never should be.